Budapest is in revolt. With uncontrolled fury, crowds set fire to Russian flags and put Soviet books to the torch. The Red Star is sent tumbling into the gutter. Word comes of shooting on the other side of the city, and the rebels, armed now, run to the scene. A quiet park has become a no man's land.
There was never a more prominent display of a country's resolve for freedom than in 1956 Hungary. Hungary and its citizens would be profoundly impacted by their inherent desire for freedom. The consequences they paid for this desire would be dear. The atrocities derived from this revolution culminated in the executions of several hundred Hungarian citizens as well as significant Hungarian figures. By the 23rd October 1956, Hungary was a prominent example of the stern authoritarian government established by the communist leadership and led by Mateusz Rákosi. In fact, under Rákosi, the Hungarian government was among the most oppressive. The state security police forcibly relocated thousands of people to acquire property and accommodation for the Working People's Party members. More than 26,000 people were forcibly removed from Budapest in 1 year. They were arrested, tortured, tried, imprisoned in concentration camps, and executed. The deportees suffered horrifying living conditions and were often used as slave labor on farms. These conditions killed many Hungarians. In Budapest, jobs and housing were increasingly hard to find, and the Hungarian economy experienced a multitude of tribulations. Hungary agreed to pay $300 million to several countries for war reparations, and the Hungarian currency experienced a profound depreciation. These policies culminated in an outcry from the Hungarian citizens.
2 hét múlva jött Mikoyan, az őrmény.
Mikoyan, the Armenian wheeler dealer, arrived.
Rákosival mentünk ki Rákosért.
Rákosi and I went to meet him at the airport and took him back by car.
És hoztuk be Mikoyan. Már majdnem beértünk.
We were almost at the guest house when Mikoyan turned to Rákosi and said, "The Soviet leadership has decided you are ill."
Úgy döntött, hogy maga beteg.
Well, Rákosi didn't think he was ill. But of course in those days, illness was a political decision. Mikoyan continued, "You will need treatment in Moscow, so you will have to resign."
The revolution had been predicated from political repression and economic decline. On the 23rd October 1956, 20,000 protesters marched through the streets of Budapest. The protesters included students and workers, and they demanded freedom of speech, the disbanding of the secret police, and the removal of Soviet troops. The jubilant crowd waved the Hungarian flag, proudly displaying the communist coat of arms cut out of their flag, and portraits of Emre Nagy, a leader that could reform the party. 200,000 protesters soon gathered around the Parliament building, but remained peaceful. By 9:30, the provoked crowd, stirred by their passion for change, toppled the Stalin 30-foot-high statue. Protesters also congregated outside the Radio Budapest building, which was heavily guarded by the state security police. After the protesters attempted to broadcast their demands, the state security police fired upon the crowd, which killed many. Protesters reacted aggressively. Police cars were set on fire. Guns were seized and communist symbols were defaced.
I don't know how the guns work, but one older man, his name was Pisto bácsi, he says, "Don't worry about it, I'm gonna teach you." And then I looked at the gun was bigger than me. They explained to me and showed me a couple of times. And the very first time I had to use it, I closed my eyes because, for scared. I never used guns
Everywhere
before.
in the country, the Hungarian tricolour was flying with the middle torn out, the communist emblem torn out. It seemed to be, a completely liberated country.
By the 24th of October, 1956, the Soviets reacted to the uprising by sending tanks to Budapest. The tanks were stationed outside the Parliament building, and Soviet soldiers guarded bridges and crossroads, while the Hungarian revolutionaries set up their own barricades across Budapest. Emre Nagy pleaded for an end to the violence and promised to institute political reforms as he became Hungary's new prime minister. However, the violence persisted and the protesters continued to arm themselves against the periodic bloodshed. The preponderance of the revolutionaries' aggression was directed towards the state security police, who had arrested, tortured, tried, imprisoned in concentration camps, and executed thousands of Hungarian people before the revolution. On the 25th October 1956, another crowd of protesters gathered outside the Parliament building. The state security police fired into the crowd from rooftops of adjacent buildings, and the crowd began shooting back. The attacks at the Parliament building contributed to the collapse of the government.
It was very complicated decision to my father, as he told for 3 or 4 days. He talked with the Chinese, with other representatives, and one time they decided not to use force, then they told, no, we have to use force, yes, no, yes, no. At last it was decision, yes, to use it.
The Hungarian revolutionaries continued to aggressively combat the Soviet troops and the remainder of the state security police. These revolutionaries utilized Molotov cocktails to fight against the Soviet tanks. In the narrow streets of Budapest, communist literature was burned and the other communist symbols were removed. The 8th of October 1956, a ceasefire was arranged and the Soviet troops withdrew from Budapest to the countryside. There was almost no fighting between November 1st and November 4th. However, during this period, 200 secret policemen and Working People's Party officials were lynched. This was a short victory. Nevertheless, Emre Nagy received information that Soviet forces were moving west towards Budapest, and by 9:30 on the 3rd of November, the Soviet army surrounded Budapest. The Hungarian revolutionaries were caught off guard by the coordinated Soviet assault. On the 4th of November, Emre Nagy broadcast his final imploration that the Soviet forces were attacking Budapest and the government would remain at their posts.
Nagy Imre beszél, a Magyar Népköztársaság minisztertanácsának elnöke. Ma hajnalban a szovjet csapatok támadást indítottak fővárosunk ellen, azzal a nyilvánvaló szándékkal, hogy megdöntsék a törvényes magyar demokratikus kormányt.
What do you hope will happen now?
We hope that our country will be entirely free and we can work and we can...
The Soviet army eradicated the remnants of the Hungarian forces and did little to differentiate between Hungarian civilian and military targets. A total of several thousand Hungarians were killed, while only several hundred Soviet troops perished. Thousands were injured. In the aftermath, thousands of Hungarians were arrested. More specifically, 26,000 were tried in court, 22,000 were penalized, 13,000 were imprisoned, and several hundred executed, including Emre Nagy. On the 33rd anniversary of the revolution, Hungary proclaimed itself a republic, and the fruition of the revolution was realized.